He only asked for one thing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw anything. He simply slid a manila envelope across the kitchen table and said, "I need you to sign these tonight," and then walked back to his home office and closed the door like he'd just asked her to take out the recycling. Serena Whitfield stood in her kitchen in Oakville, Ontario, flour still on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and stared at that envelope for a long time before she touched it. Inside were 43 pages of divorce documents. A sticky note on the first page, in her husband's neat handwriting, "Sign where highlighted." She sat down on the cold tile floor and didn't get up for a very long time. They had been married for 6 years. She had given up her position as a senior architect at a firm in Toronto when his company, called Caldwell Reid Development, expanded into Vancouver, and he'd needed her to manage 2 households, 2 sets of expectations, 2 versions of the life they'd agreed to build. She had done it without complaint. She had believed, the way people believe things they cannot afford to question, that it was temporary, that once the company stabilized, she would go back, that he would see what she had sacrificed. What she hadn't seen, or maybe had refused to see, was Felicity Brandt. Felicity was 29, a junior partner at the firm that handled Caldwell Reid's legal work. She had the kind of ambition that wore expensive shoes and learned your husband's coffee order before you did. The affair had apparently been going on for 14 months. Serena learned this not from her husband, but from an email she was never supposed to see. A calendar invite, a hotel name she recognized because she and her husband had stayed there on their 5th anniversary, a suite number, a heart emoji. She hadn't said anything that night. She'd made dinner. She'd cleared the plates. She'd waited until he was asleep and then sat in her car in the driveway in the December cold until her breath fogged every window. The envelope came 6 weeks later. She signed the papers. She signed them because she was tired in a way that had no clean name, and because somewhere underneath the humiliation she understood that a man who could slide divorce documents across a kitchen table without looking you in the eye had already. The ink was just paperwork. The real leaving had been happening for years, quietly, in all the rooms she hadn't been watching. Her lawyer, a precise and impatient woman named Catherine Holt, reviewed everything and told her the division was fair on paper. The Oakville house would sell, and they'd split the proceeds. She'd get a settlement. She'd be fine. Fine. That word again. What Catherine did not know, what nobody knew yet, not even Serena herself, was that she was 8 weeks pregnant. She found out on a Tuesday in February, alone in a drugstore bathroom on Lake Shore, the test balanced on the edge of the sink. She sat with it for a very long time. She thought about calling someone. She didn't. She drove home. She made tea. She put her hand over her stomach in the quiet of her kitchen and said, to nobody, "Okay, okay." She did not tell her ex-husband. She thought about it in the weeks that followed, argued with herself about it at 3 in the morning, rehearsed conversations that never happened. But every time she picked up her phone, she thought about that envelope, that sticky note, sign where highlighted, and she put the phone back down. By April, she had moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Hamilton, started doing freelance architectural consulting from home, and had told exactly 3 people she was pregnant. Her mother, her younger sister, and Catherine, who immediately and professionally updated certain clauses in the finalized divorce agreement. She did not tell anyone she was carrying twins. The pregnancy was difficult in the way that being completely alone is always difficult. Not medically, not catastrophically, just in the 10,000 small moments where you reach for someone and find empty air. Her sister drove down from Guelph on weekends. Her mother called every evening. It was enough. It had to be enough. She thought about Owen Caldwell less than she expected to. What surprised her was that when she did think about him, it wasn't with love or anger, but with something closer to bewilderment. She kept asking herself how she had lived beside someone for 6 years and missed so much of who he actually was. She was 7 months along when she saw the news. She'd been scrolling through her phone before bed, half asleep, when a headline stopped her cold. Caldwell Reid Development under investigation for fraud. CEO Owen Caldwell faces board removal. She sat up. The article was detailed. The accusations were serious. Falsified construction permits in 3 provinces, shell companies, a pattern of bribery going back 4 years. The board had been tipped off by an internal audit. Owen's name was on documents that, his lawyers were already arguing, had been digitally altered. But the board wasn't waiting for the courts. They voted him out within 72 hours. Felicity Brandt, the article noted briefly near the bottom, had taken a position at a competing firm in Calgary 2 months prior. Serena read that line twice. Then she set her phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark and felt something she hadn't expected. Nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief. Just a strange, hollow quiet, like a sound that had been running in the background for years finally going off. She pressed her hand to her stomach. The babies moved the way they always did at night, restless and insistent. "I know," she said softly. "I know." She gave birth on a Wednesday in late June, at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, at 11:47 in the morning and 12:02 in the afternoon. A girl and a boy. The girl came first, screaming with what the nurse cheerfully described as impressive lung capacity. The boy came quieter, looking up at the fluorescent light above the delivery table with an expression of profound skepticism that Serena would later say he had never quite lost. She named them Hazel and James. She lay in the hospital room that first night, with one of them in each arm, and felt something so large she didn't have a word for it. Not happiness exactly, though it was that. Something wider. Something that made the last 14 months make sense, not as a story about loss, but as a story about arrival. She was alive in a way she hadn't been in years. She had been home from the hospital for 11 days when Owen showed up. He stood on her front step in a suit that was slightly too large for him now. He'd lost weight. Holding a gift bag with tissue paper, she was almost certain. Felicity had not helped him pick out. She saw him through the window before she answered the door and felt her body go very still. She opened it anyway. He looked at her. He looked at the baby she was holding, Hazel, fussing softly, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "I heard," he said. Serena, I heard you had twins," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "You slid a manila envelope across the kitchen table," she said, and walked away. He had no answer for that. She watched him understand that he wasn't going to find one. "I'd like to be part of their lives," he said after a long moment. "I know I have no right to ask." "But I'm asked." Serena looked at him, who had taken everything she offered and quietly decided it wasn't what he wanted, who had never once in 6 years asked about the cost of what she'd given up, who had now, when it suited him, decided he wanted to be present. She thought about what Catherine had told her in a call 3 weeks before the birth, reviewing the finalized paperwork one more time. Her lawyer had caught something neither of them had noticed until then. A clause buried in an addendum, which Owen had signed alongside everything else. A clause that, under Ontario family law, read as a voluntary forfeiture of parental rights in the event of children born within the window of separation and without paternity acknowledgement during the divorce proceedings. Serena had not put it there. She hadn't even known it was there until Catherine called. Catherine's voice had been carefully neutral when she explained it. "I want you to know exactly what this means before you make any decisions," she'd said. Serena had been very quiet for a moment. "Send me the page number," she'd said finally. She'd read it 4 times. Then she'd gone to make dinner, and fed herself, and sat with the fact of it until it settled. She was not a vindictive woman. She knew that about herself. But she also knew that she had spent 6 years making herself small for a man who had repaid her by scheduling her removal like a routine calendar item. She hadn't contested the clause. Now she looked at Owen on her front step and said, "I think you should talk to Catherine." He blinked. "Your lawyer? She'll explain things clearly. She's very good at that." He left. He came back 3 days later with his own lawyer. There were phone calls, formal letters, a series of conversations that Serena did not attend personally, because Catherine was very, very good at her job, and because Serena had 2 11-day-old infants and not a single minute to spend in a room with Owen Caldwell discussing the consequences of his own signature. The conclusion took 5 weeks. It was not pleasant. Owen's lawyers argued the clause was ambiguous. Catherine demonstrated with considerable patience and documentation that it was not. Owen's fraud case was ongoing and his legal resources were stretched. His public reputation was in pieces. He did not get what he came to her door asking for. The first time Serena met Declan Mercer was at a planning commission meeting in Burlington, 9 months after the twins were born. She had gone back to work properly by then, a consultant contract with a mid-sized firm doing mixed-use residential development along the lake. The meeting was routine, the kind of thing she attended twice a month, and she arrived late because Hazel had thrown up on her blouse 20 minutes before she needed to leave and she'd had to change. Declan Mercer was presenting. He was the principal architect behind a development proposal she'd been asked to review. He was calm, direct, and had clearly done the work. He answered the commission's questions without defensiveness and without performing. When the meeting broke, he came and found her, because apparently he'd read her written comments on the proposal and had thoughts. They argued for 45 minutes in the parking lot about load-bearing wall placement. He was right about two things. She was right about one. They both knew it and said so. He asked if she'd want to continue the conversation over coffee sometime. She told him she had a 4-month-old son and daughter at home, and very limited patience for vague social invitations. He took out his phone and said, "Saturday morning? There's a good place on Brant Street," and showed her the address. She looked at him for a moment. "Saturday," she said. 9 o'clock. I have a hard stop at 10:30. He nodded, like that was entirely reasonable. It was the thing she remembered later, when she tried to trace back the beginning. Not the parking lot, not the proposal, not the argument. The nod. The simple, unhesitating acknowledgement that her time was real and her limits were legitimate. She had not been offered that in a very long time. They had coffee on Saturday. They had it again the following Saturday. He met Hazel and James for the first time on a Thursday evening in March, when Serena's sister canceled and Declan had offered to come to her, entirely without making it an occasion. He sat on the living room floor with James on his knee and talked to Serena about a project in Niagara while Hazel grabbed his finger and refused to let go. He didn't make a performance of it. That was the thing. He didn't announce his feelings about babies or comment on how he was doing, or look at her to see if she was watching him do well. He just sat there, solid and easy, like he was exactly where he expected to be. Serena watched him from the kitchen doorway and felt something shift in her chest. She wasn't ready. She knew she wasn't ready. She said so, directly, on a walk along the waterfront in April, because she had learned, the hard way through years of not saying things, that directness was the only currency worth spending. Declan listened. He said he understood. He said he wasn't in a hurry, and she could see from the way he said it that it was true, that it wasn't a strategy, that he was simply telling her where he stood and leaving the rest entirely to her. They kept having coffee. They kept arguing about architecture. In May, he brought groceries over one evening because she'd mentioned offhand that she hadn't had time to shop. In June, she called him at 11 at night because Hazel had a fever and she was scared and her mother wasn't answering, and he was at her door in 22 minutes. He stayed until the fever broke, sitting beside her on the nursery floor, their backs against the wall, talking quietly about nothing in particular, until Hazel's breathing evened out and the monitor went silent. At some point, Serena had fallen asleep against his shoulder. She woke up to the pale gray light of early morning and the sound of James stirring in the next room. Declan was still awake. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She got up and went to get James, and when she came back to the kitchen, Declan had made coffee. The fraud investigation concluded the following September. Owen Caldwell was not charged criminally. Not enough of the falsified documents could be definitively traced to his direct action, rather than to a junior associate who had, it turned out, been systematically covering his own exposure using his boss's access credentials. Owen had been negligent, blindly, expensively negligent, but not deliberately criminal. The board's removal stood. The company was restructured under new leadership. Owen settled the civil claims. He sold the Oakville house. He moved to Calgary, which was where Felicity Brant was, though nobody who knew Serena was tactless enough to say so. She learned all this from Catherine, in a brief update call, and then put it in the same box where she kept all the other things that had once seemed enormous, and now simply were what they were. The twins were 15 months old by then, and had very strong opinions about scrambled eggs. On a Sunday morning in October, when the light through the kitchen window was the particular gold that only happens in fall in Ontario, Serena sat at her table with Hazel on her lap, and James attempting to climb the chair beside her, and Declan across the table with his coffee, reading something on his phone. He looked up and caught her watching him. She had been thinking about the kitchen table she used to have in Oakville, about what had been placed on it and what that had meant, about how a table is just a table until someone makes it into something else. "What?" he said, because she was smiling. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that particular steadiness she had come to understand was just how he was. Not performing calm, simply being it. And then he smiled back and looked down at his phone again. Hazel grabbed a fistful of Serena's hair. James successfully climbed the chair and looked profoundly pleased with himself. Outside, the maples along the street were burning orange and red, the way they did every year in this country, dependable as a promise. As if the world was determined to remind you that after every long and difficult thing, something would eventually be golden again.